There was a time you stood in a room full of people who were laughing, and you laughed too. But a part of you was somewhere else, watching, cataloguing, noticing who leaned in when the joke landed and who flinched a half-second before pretending to smile. People thought you were somewhere far away. They called you distant, detached, naive even. As if you hadn't understood the room, as if the world had simply passed you by while you were lost in your own quiet weather. But you weren't lost. You were never lost.
You were what you're watching.
There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being misread your entire life, from being seen as someone who didn't notice, when in truth you noticed everything. The tone under the words, the silence between two people who used to talk more, the way love sometimes wears the same clothes as obligation. You saw it all. You just didn't say it. Because somewhere along the way, you learned that seeing too much, and saying too much, could cost you the very connection you were trying to protect. So you built a quiet architecture inside yourself. A place to stand back. A place where you could love people without needing to hand them the blueprint of your heart. And the world, not knowing what to do with your silence, called it avoidance, called it distance, called it a wall. But a wall built brick by brick out of pain is not the same as an absence of feeling. Sometimes the deepest feelers build the highest walls. Not because they feel too little, but because they once felt too much, too early, with no one there to catch what spilled over. Think about a child who learns that needing someone is dangerous. Not because anyone said it directly, but because every time they reached out, the hand on the other side was busy, or tired, or gone. That child doesn't stop loving. They just stop announcing it. They become fluent in a language only they can hear. The language of watching from a safe distance, of loving quietly so the loss, if it comes, will hurt a little less. And so you grew into someone who could read a room before you'd even sat down. Someone who could sense a goodbye 3 conversations before it happened. People called this coldness. But read closely, and you'll see, it was never coldness. It was vigilance dressed as calm. There's an old idea, older than any of us, that the wisest people are often mistaken for the quietest ones. Not because wisdom is silent by nature, but because wisdom has learned the cost of speaking before it's ready. The philosopher who sits at the edge of the gathering isn't absent from it. They are the one actually present, while everyone else is performing presence. For years, maybe you believed the story others told about you, that you were guarded because you didn't understand connection, that your hesitance was ignorance of what love requires. But here is the truth arriving late, like light from a star that already changed shape long before it reached you. You were never naive. You knew exactly what love could cost. That's why you moved so carefully around it. And one day, maybe on an ordinary afternoon, maybe in the middle of a conversation that meant nothing on the surface, something in you finally turned. You realized the distance you kept wasn't proof you didn't understand people. It was proof you understood them too well, too early, and had no framework yet for surviving that understanding without disappearing into it. This is the strange gift of a delayed awakening. It doesn't erase the years you spent protecting yourself. It reframes them. Suddenly the story isn't, I was too afraid to be close. The story becomes, I was gathering the courage to be close on my own terms. Once I trusted I wouldn't be erased in the process. Growth rarely announces itself with fireworks. More often, it arrives like a tide. So slow you don't notice the shoreline has moved until you look back and realize you're standing somewhere entirely new. One day you find yourself staying in the room a little longer, answering a question a little more honestly, letting someone see the version of you that used to only exist in your private observations. And this is where the real transformation begins. Not when you stop watching, because watching was never the problem. The problem was believing that watching had to mean staying separate. The healing isn't in becoming someone who doesn't notice. The healing is in learning that you can notice everything about a person and still choose to stay. Because here's what almost no one tells you about avoidance. It isn't the absence of love. It's love that has learned to survive without letting anyone hold it. And the day you realize this, really realize it, you stop mourning the years you spent behind the glass, and you start honoring what that glass protected. A heart that was paying attention the entire time. A heart that never stopped caring, even when it looked like it had checked out of the room. So if you've ever been called too guarded, too quiet, too far away, ask yourself honestly whether you were absent, or whether you were simply the only one who saw the whole picture and didn't know yet how to speak it without breaking. You were never naive. You were the witness the whole story needed. And now, finally, you get to become something even braver than a witness. You get to become someone who stays, fully seen, in the very rooms you once only watched from the edge of. That is not the end of your distance. That is the beginning of your arrival. There is a particular kind of silence that gets misunderstood the moment it enters a room. People hear silence and assume emptiness, assume that behind the quiet eyes is a mind that has simply drifted, disengaged, gone somewhere less demanding than the present moment. But there is another kind of silence entirely.
One that has nothing to do with absence and everything to do with depth. This is the silence of the watcher, and the watcher's silence is never empty.
It is full, so full that words would only spill the contents before they've had time to settle into meaning. Think of how a lake looks still on the surface while an entire ecosystem moves beneath it. Currents shifting, light bending, life continuing in a language the surface never reveals. This is what it means to carry a watcher's mind. From the outside, you appear calm, unreadable, maybe even indifferent. But inside, everything is being processed. Every glance, every pause before someone answers a question, every small betrayal of tone that reveals more truth than the words themselves ever could. The watcher isn't failing to participate in the room. The watcher is participating in a different register, one most people never learn to access, because it requires a kind of patience the modern world rarely rewards. Somewhere in your history, this watching became a skill before it became an identity. Perhaps you learned early that speaking too soon could be costly, that reacting before understanding could hand your vulnerability to someone who didn't know how to hold it gently. So you waited. You observed. You let information settle before you let it out into the world as opinion or emotion. Over time, this watching stopped being a defense mechanism and became simply how you moved through life. Careful, attentive, endlessly perceiving what others missed entirely. And this is the cruel irony of being a watcher. The very skill that makes you deeply attuned to others is often the same skill that gets mistaken for distance. People confuse quiet attention for absence, when in truth, the watcher is often the most present person in the room. Simply present in a way that doesn't announce itself. While others are busy performing engagement, filling silence with noise to prove they're listening, the watcher is doing the actual work of listening, quietly gathering the emotional data everyone else is too loud to notice. To understand the watcher within is to understand that stillness is not the opposite of depth. It is often its source. The quietest person in the room may be the one holding the clearest picture of what's actually happening, long before anyone else catches up. Their silence was never empty. It was simply speaking a language most people never slowed down enough to learn how to hear. There is a stillness some people wear like armor, and if you look closely enough, you'll notice it doesn't move the way ordinary calm moves. Ordinary calm is loose in the shoulders. It doesn't track the exits. It doesn't catalogue who just entered the room or notice the half-second delay before someone's smile arrives. But this other kind of calm, the one born from vigilance, is a stillness that costs something. It is a performance so practiced it no longer feels like performance at all. And underneath it, quietly, endlessly, a part of the mind is still working, still scanning, still asking the question it learned to ask long ago. Is it safe here, right now, with these people, in this moment? This kind of vigilance rarely comes from nowhere. It is built, often in childhood, often without anyone intending to build it. A home where moods shifted without warning teaches a child to read faces before they can read words. A relationship where love arrived inconsistently teaches a person to anticipate the withdrawal before it happens, to brace before the blow lands, to stay one step ahead of pain by predicting its shape in advance. Over years, this anticipation stops feeling like fear and starts feeling like intuition. The nervous system doesn't remember the specific wound anymore, it just remembers the pattern, and so it keeps watching, keeps calculating, long after the danger that created the habit has disappeared. What makes this so difficult to recognize, in yourself or in someone you love, is that vigilance wears the mask of composure so convincingly. People who carry it are often praised for being calm under pressure, unshaken in chaos, steady when everyone else is falling apart. What no one realizes is that this steadiness isn't peace, it's readiness. It's a body that has learned to brace so early and so often that bracing has become its resting state. The calm isn't the absence of alarm, it's alarm that has been trained to stay invisible. This is why so many people who seem emotionally unavailable are, in truth, some of the most emotionally attuned people you will ever meet. Their guardedness isn't a lack of feeling, it's an excess of feeling that has learned, painfully, to stay contained. They notice everything. The shift in someone's voice, the tension in a shared silence, the subtle absence of warmth where warmth used to be. Because noticing was once their only form of protection. When you cannot control what happens to you, you learn to control how much you see coming. And so the watching never stops, even in rooms that are safe, even with people who mean no harm, because the body doesn't yet know the difference between danger that has passed and danger that might return. To understand vigilance, disguised as calm, is to understand that composure is not always peace. Sometimes it is the quietest, most exhausting kind of strength a person can carry. There is an assumption we make about closeness, that it always looks like reaching, like speaking first, like filling silence with reassurance. So when someone keeps their distance, we assume they must not care enough to close the gap. But distance and devotion are not always opposites. Sometimes distance is devotion's most careful expression, chosen not because love is absent, but because love is trying, in its own imperfect way, to do no harm. Picture someone who loves deeply but has learned through experience that closeness can become a weapon in the wrong hands. Maybe they once gave everything to a person who used that generosity against them. Maybe they learned that vulnerability, once shared, cannot always be trusted with the same tenderness it was given in. So they begin to love differently, not less, but more carefully. They step back not because the feeling has faded, but because they are trying to protect both people from a version of themselves that might spiral, might cling, might ask for more than the relationship can hold. This is not indifference. This is restraint born from care. There's a kind of person who would rather disappear quietly than watch someone slowly grow tired of them. Who would rather create distance on their own terms than wait for it to be handed to them without warning. This isn't weakness. It's a survival strategy shaped by history, an attempt to hold on to some dignity in the parts of life where control feels impossible. When someone withdraws instead of demanding closeness, it often isn't because they value the relationship less. It's because they've learned, sometimes the hard way, that demanding closeness rarely creates the safety they're hoping for. Consider, too, how many people equate love with sacrifice, with disappearing themselves into someone else's needs. And consider the quiet, radical act of a person who instead says, without words, I love you enough to not lose myself trying to keep you. Distance, in this light, becomes less as a rejection and more a boundary. An act of self-respect wrapped inside an act of care for the other person too. It says, I would rather give you my honesty from a small distance than my resentment from up close. This reframing changes everything. Suddenly, the people we once called avoidant, cold, or hard to reach reveal themselves as something else entirely. People who learned to protect connection by protecting themselves first. Their distance isn't the opposite of intimacy. It's intimacy filtered through caution, love expressed in the only dialect that ever felt safe. To rethink avoidance this way is to stop asking why someone won't come closer, and start asking what taught them that closeness could be dangerous in the first place. Because often, behind every careful distance, there is a person still capable of deep devotion, simply waiting for a kind of safety patient enough to prove that closeness, this time, won't cost them everything. Every wall has a history, and no one builds one out of nothing. If you trace the foundation carefully enough, you'll find it wasn't built out of coldness or indifference. It was built brick by brick, out of moments that taught a person that openness could be costly. This is the architecture of self-protection, and like any structure, it didn't rise overnight. It was constructed slowly, quietly, often without the person even realizing they were building anything at all. Think about the first time vulnerability didn't go the way it was supposed to.
Maybe it was small, a secret shared and later repeated by someone who wasn't supposed to repeat it. Maybe it was larger, a need expressed and met with dismissal, or worse, with mockery.
The mind doesn't need many of these moments to learn its lesson. It only needs a few, repeated at the right age, in the right context, to conclude something that will shape decades to come. It is not safe to be fully known, and so the building begins. The first brick is usually small, a hesitation before sharing something personal. The next brick comes when that hesitation is rewarded with safety, reinforcing the idea that holding back protects you. Brick by brick, the structure rises, not out of malice, not out of a desire to shut people out, but out of an instinct as old as survival itself. If something hurt you once, you build so it cannot easily hurt you again. What makes this architecture so difficult to dismantle later in life is that it worked. It did its job. It kept the person safe during years when they didn't have the tools, the support, or the safety to handle repeated emotional injury. The wall wasn't dysfunction, it was function, perfectly calibrated to a specific kind of pain in a specific season of life. The tragedy isn't that the wall was built. The tragedy is that it often outlives the danger it was built to protect against. Standing tall long after the threat has passed, still guarding rooms that no longer need guarding. This is why healing rarely feels like triumph. It feels like grief. Because taking down a wall you built to survive means confronting how much pain it once held back, and admitting that the danger, real as it was, is no longer the danger you're facing today. It means learning to distinguish between the ghosts of old wounds and the actual people standing in front of you now. People who may be safe, even if your nervous system hasn't caught up to that fact yet. To understand the architecture of self-protection is to stop asking why someone built walls in the first place and start asking what they were surviving when they laid the first brick. Because behind every fortress, however guarded, however quiet, there is almost always a story of someone who once needed protecting and did the only thing they knew how to do to make it through.